Welcome once again to this virtual class on neuroanatomy. This is a series of lectures we've been having in neuroanatomy, and in this particular lecture, we are going to look at the descending pathways of the spinal cord and brainstem. Maybe just to bring to perspective, we've been having several lectures on neuroanatomy, and the theme we are doing right now is concerning spinal cord organization and tractology. Specifically in that particular theme, we've already had 2 lectures. The first one was on structural organization of the spinal cord and the external and internal features of the spinal cord in particular. The second lecture focused on the ascending pathways of the spinal cord and the brainstem. So this third one focuses on the descending pathways of the spinal cord and the brainstem. Generally speaking, we may want to define a few terms before we go into the specifics of this particular lecture. So let's begin by defining or reminding ourselves about the term tractology. We use the term tractology in neuroanatomy or neurophysiology to refer to study of tracts. And remember, a tract, which is also called fasciculus, refers to a bundle of neuronal fibers found within the central nervous system that have similar function and travel together. So there are axonal fibers that are found within the central nervous system. That means that they constitute white matter. They are traveling together and they have the same function, that is a tract or fasciculus. We can classify tracts of the central nervous system based on very many things. For example, you can classify them based on modality, so that you have sensory tracts, you have motor tracts, like what we just done. You can also classify tracts based on where they are found. For example, you just talked about spinal cord tracts. You can also have brainstem tracts. We can also, and a common way of classifying tracts based on where they come from and where they're going. And there's some terminologies that you might hear in this lecture or in other lectures that you had on tractology. For example, spinothalamic tract means from the spinal cord to thalamus. Corticospinal tract means from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, and the like. So those are based on origin and termination. We can also classify some tracts based on how they look, the morphology, their shape, how they look like. And a good example is fasciculus gracilis, which means gracile tract, very thin, slender tract, so to speak. Importantly, also, we classify tract based on the direction of the impulses. And this is almost the same as the modality, except perhaps we want to use different terminologies. So the ones that carry impulses to the central nervous system or upwards to the brain are called the afferent tracts. And basically, those are the ascending tracts or the sensory tracts. And there are those ones which carry impulses from the brain outwards. Those ones will be called now descending tracts, or basically those are the motor tracts. You can also call them the efferent tracts. So remember, the ascending tracts are carrying sensory impulses upwards. These sensory impulses are coming from sensory receptors and they're going towards the cerebral cortex so that they can be interpreted. And so that constitutes the afferent system of the nervous system. The descending tracts, on the other hand, and that is the focus of our attention today, carry motor impulses downwards, and I'm using the term downwards in quotes to mean just far away from the cerebral cortex or far away from the brain. Usually, these impulses are directed towards effectors, which are muscles and glands, and therefore the descending tracts constitute the efferent system. just a reminder of how the central nervous system operates in terms of its coordination and integration of body function so that we understand something more about the descending tract. Remember in general that we have what we call sensory receptors in the body that detect environmental stimuli, and once they've detected these environmental stimuli, they carry these impulses to the brain and in particular to the cerebral cortex for a number of reasons. The order of neurons that come from the receptors to the cerebral cortex, not just one, but a relay of 3 neurons generally. The first order sensory neuron terminates in the brainstem or the spinal cord. And this first order sensory neuron is actually a peripheral nerve. Its cell body is usually outside the central nervous system in most cases. The second order neuron is the one that peaks from where the first order neuron left and terminates into the thalamus. Remember, one thing that the second neuron does is that it decussates, crosses over to the opposite side. The third order neuron, or otherwise known as the tertiary sensory neuron, is the one that arises from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, a region where a number of things are going to occur. So the third order neurons are the one that constitute what we call the thalamocortical projections or radiations. At the cerebral cortex, the sensation will be interpreted. Some memory will be kept about the sensation, and importantly, a reaction will be provided. The reaction that's being provided is a response that the central nervous system creates that need to be relayed down backwards to the effectors. And so this is where we want to discuss. We've already discussed sensory systems, but now want to discuss the motor systems. Generally, the efferent pathway from the central nervous system to the effectors, which target muscles and glands, will be a relay of 2 major neurons. We have what we call the upper motor neuron that come from, in this case, the cerebral cortex, but we're going to see it doesn't have to come from the cerebral cortex. But importantly, it terminates somewhere in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. This upper motor neuron is entirely within the central nervous system. Then we have the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron arises from where the upper motor neuron has left. And this lower motor neuron is the one that exits the central nervous system and terminates onto the effector. Therefore, the lower motor neuron constitutes part of peripheral nervous system. One thing that need to remember is that the upper motor neuron, which is arising from some regions within the central nervous and terminating the brainstem and spinal cord, most of the time decussates, just like the second order sensory neuron also most of the time decussates. And remember, the decussation leads to one side of the hemisphere controlling the opposite side of the body. All right, so that is basically the 2 divisions of the nervous system. The sensory division, which is the afferent division, is the ascending division. The motor division, which is the efferent division, is the descending division. So when you talk about descending tract, you want to look at this side of the physiology. Therefore, what do you need to learn in this particular lecture? First, I'll begin by giving some introductory overview of the neuronal pathways that constitute the descending pathways or the descending tracts. Then we'll focus on something known as the pyramidal motor pathways. We look at the origin, the components, the course and termination of the pyramidal motor pathways. After that, we'll focus on something called the extrapyramidal pathways. We'll just give some examples. Well, after defining what they are, we'll give some examples and their functions. And we'll finish by talking about what we call the lower motor neuron we've already mentioned what it is. We'll just talk more about it, and we'll talk about its disorders. Let's begin with the introductory overview of the neuronal pathways that constitute the descending tracts. So we've agreed that tracts are axonal bundles, but now descending tracts are bundles of axonal fibers that carry efferent impulses from the central nervous system towards the effectors. In this case, the central nervous system is the brain. That's what we're talking about. So they carry impulses from the brain towards the effectors. These neuronal pathways are concerned mainly with the control of muscle movements. So the movements of our musculature are controlled by these tracts. They also control the tone within these muscles. And overall, they also control our body posture. So as you think about motor system, think about those functions that they do. Well, they all revolve around skeletal musculature. Most descending pathways will have the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron, as we've already mentioned. This image shows you examples of these descending tracts. There are quite many, and we'll be talking about them. On the opposite side, we have the ascending tracts. So these ones we'd already mentioned in the previous lecture. This image is an important one, showing you the anatomy of the upper motor compared to the anatomy of the lower motor neuron. So something to just grasp from this image is that the upper motor neuron arises from the brain going downwards. And importantly, it may decussate, as this one has actually done. Then it will synapse either in the brainstem or spinal cord. The one we're having right now has synapse in the spinal cord. The lower motor neuron then arises from there and leave the central nervous system to form part of the peripheral nerve. And this lower motor neuron is the one that reaches the effector. In this case, we can see that muscle being innervated by this neuron. So remember upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. When we talk of tracts, remember we mentioned that tracts are found in the central nervous system. That means that descending tracts are actually pathways formed by the upper motor neurons, as opposed to pathways formed by lower motor neurons. They're just pathways formed by upper motor neurons. So let's say something more about the upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron arises from higher centers of the central nervous system and is entirely within the central nervous system. The image here shows you an upper motor neuron that's arising from the cerebral cortex. That's an example of a higher center. Most of the time, the upper motor neuron will decussate to the opposite side. There are a few cases where the upper motor neuron does not decussate, but there are few and we'll mention them. Most of the time, the upper motor neuron will decussate to the opposite side. And depending on the tract we're talking about, the decussation level could be at different parts. Now, at the point of termination, the upper motor neuron may synapse directly with the lower motor neuron as shown in this image, or it may synapse indirectly. When it synapses indirectly means that it synapses with the lower motor neuron via an interneuron or via multiple interneurons. And we have many cases where there's an interneuron between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. In most cases, those interneurons will just be at the same level at the point of termination of the upper motor neuron. How about the lower motor neuron? The lower motor neuron arises either from the brainstem or the spinal cord. usually at the level of termination of the upper motor neuron. It comes out from the central nervous system, therefore to join the peripheral nervous system. And the axons of lower motor neurons usually will therefore form part of the peripheral nerve. It could therefore be part of a cranial nerve if it was arising from the brainstem, or part of a spinal nerve if it's arising from the spinal cord. Some cranial nerve could actually be purely motor, but some of them could be both motor and sensory. So if it's both motor and sensory, means that this neuron is forming part of that large neuron. If it's purely motor, it means that all the axons are actually motor in function. Usually, the lower motor neuron does not decussate. We only have one example of a lower motor neuron that decussates, and that is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is a fourth cranial nerve, and is the only one we know that actually decussates. The decussation, however, is not even external. The decussation is within the midbrain after the origin of after the axons have come out from the cell bodies of the lower motor neuron. That's when the decussation occurs, but still within the midbrain. It's the only lower motor neuron that we know to decussate. Otherwise, all the other lower motor neurons do not decussate. Okay, so as we continue talking about upper motor neurons, I want to clarify on a concept of pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts. So remember, tracts are formed by upper motor neurons, but we can have two types of upper motor neuron pathways depending on the origin of these upper motor neurons. For example, there's a category we call the pyramidal pathway. The pyramidal pathway refers to the upper motor neurons that arise from the cerebral cortex. So their cell bodies are located within the cerebral cortex, and they descend downwards to go to synapse with the lower motor neurons wherever they are found. That constitutes the pyramidal system. Some pyramidal tracts will arise from the cerebral cortex and terminate onto the brainstem. At the brainstem, they'll synapse with cell bodies of neurons that constitute motor cranial nerves. Such pyramidal pathways that terminate at the brainstem constitute what we call the corticonuclear pathway. Sometimes you may hear the term corticobulbar, and some people have used them interchangeably. Well, the strict meaning is that corticonuclear refers to the descending tract that targets cranial nerve motor nuclei of the brainstem. The term corticobulbar is a general term that refers to tracts which arise from the cerebral cortex to terminate onto the brainstem, and they don't have to necessarily terminate on cranial nerve motor nuclei. They may also terminate in other types of nuclei, like there are things called pontine nuclei and the like. So the term corticonuclear is a more specific term for this pathway. However, even if you use the term corticobulbar, it will still be okay. It's exactly a general term. So the pyramidal tracts that arise from the cerebral cortex and terminate in the brainstem constitute the corticonuclear pathways, and the pyramidal fibers that arise from the cerebral cortex and reach the spinal cord so that they can synapse with spinal nerves, therefore constitute the corticospinal tracts. So pyramidal pathways are two varieties: corticonuclear, which may be called corticobulbar, and the corticospinal pathway. That is a bit different from what we call the extrapyramidal pathway. The extrapyramidal pathway refers to descending tracts, which means there's still upper motor neurons that do not arise from the cerebral cortex. And the big question, therefore, is if they do not arise from the cerebral cortex, where do they come from? Simple answer, they actually arise from various nuclei within the brainstem. So they come from multiple nuclei within the brainstem. Point to note is that even though they arise from the brainstem, these brainstem motor nuclei are actually being controlled by other systems, and in particular, the basal ganglia control this nuclei. Cerebellum also control this nuclei. So when you talk of extrapyramidal pathway, we're referring to those descending upper motor neurons that arise from the brainstem nuclei. They could be coming from reticular nuclei, so you call it reticulospinal. They could be coming from the red nucleus, then you call it rubnospinal, and the like. We'll talk about them under extrapyramidal pathways. So I hope you've gotten the distinction between the upper motor neurons that constitute pyramidal system arising from the cerebral cortex and the upper motor neurons that constitute the extrapyramidal system arising from the brainstem. Also, you've gotten the distinction between corticonuclear and corticospinal pathways, which are part of pyramidal system. Therefore, we can go to our second agenda and look at the origin, components, cause, and termination of the pyramidal motor pathways. The image shown here shows you the histological layers of a neocortex, described to have 6 layers. Layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, 5, and 6. In particular, remember that layer 5 is called the inner pyramidal layer or the internal pyramidal layer. Don't confuse the layer 3, which is called the outer pyramidal layer. Now, the pyramidal neurons, the pyramidal pathways, we've already agreed that they arise from the cerebral cortex. These upper motor neurons arise from the cerebral cortex. But which region of the cortex? We've already mentioned that they arise from layer 5. Now, layer 5, and especially in the motor cortex, usually contain some large neurons. We call them the giant pyramidal cells of Betz. These are the neurons that give rise to the descending tract that constitute the pyramidal pathways. Remember that pyramidal neurons usually have long apical dendrites. So this is not the axon, but the dendrite. But the axon comes from this side, so the basal axon. So the axon that comes from this side is the one that goes down. And in this image, so we'll expect those neurons to project down to this white matter. Specifically, on which cortical areas will we be having origin of the pyramidal pathways? There are a number of cortical areas in the cerebral cortex that give you these pathways. One is the primary motor cortex, which is area number 4 of the cerebral cortex. So usually located on the precentral gyrus. We have the premotor area. That's area number 6. We have the supplementary motor cortex. We have the Broca's area, which is on the inferior frontal gyrus, specifically on the pars orbicularis and the pars triangularis of the dominant hemisphere. We have the frontal eye field located within the middle frontal gyrus, area number 8. And we have somatosensory cortices. So the statement I'm making is that the pyramidal pathways do not just arise from the motor cortices only. There's evidence that actually some pyramidal neurons from the somatosensory cortices also contribute to the formation of the pyramidal pathways. Important to note, pyramidal pathway arise from the cortex and histologically layer 5 of the cerebral cortex. After talking about the origin of the pyramidal pathways, we can now talk about its cause. We'll talk about the cause of pyramidal pathways within the cerebrum and also within the brainstem. Let's talk about the cause within the cerebrum. Think about it. If the neurons arise from the cortex here, the next thing to do is to just project their axons down into this region. So after rising from the cerebral cortex, the axons of these neurons descend through the white matter of the cerebrum, which we call the corona radiator. So this region here is called the corona radiator, where the fibers actually find themselves. They're not the only fibers that will constitute the corona radiator. Corona radiator has mixture of white matter tracts, both ascending and descending. This image shows you those neurons and their axons descending through the corona radiator. After descending through the corona radiator, the neurons are usually restricted into small region so that they actually converge to pass through a narrow path. That narrow path of fibers is what we call the internal capsule. So take note that the internal capsule is actually an example of a collection of projection fibers on one side of the hemisphere. Okay, it's bilaterally placed. So if you look at one side, the projection fibers of that hemisphere, a lot of them pass through the internal capsule so that they can reach the brainstem. So this zone there is what we call the internal capsule before the fibers reach the brainstem. Maybe in the previous image, you may have seen it again. So from the corona radiator, this white tract there is what we are calling the internal capsule. So the fibers will pass through here, the internal capsule, to reach the brainstem. This image is an important one. It's an axial section of the brain so that we can see the location of the internal capsule. The internal capsule has several parts. We call this the anterior limb of the internal capsule. We call this the genu of the internal capsule. We call this the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Way behind it, some region there or there is what we call the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. And it's called retrolentiform because this is the lentiform. So this is the region of the internal capsule behind the lentiform. That's what's called the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. And there's another region of the internal capsule we are not able to see from this view because we've taken a higher horizontal level. However, that region of the internal capsule is a region below the lentiform, and so we call the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. So internal capsule has several parts. It carries or it traverses the projection fibers, both ascending as well as descending. Different parts of the internal capsule are occupied by different tracts. To be specific, the ones we're talking about, we mentioned that we have corticonuclear and corticospinal. The corticonuclear fibers, which arise from the cerebral cortex to terminate to the brainstem motor nuclei of cranial nerves, corticonuclear pathways pass through the genu of the internal capsule. On the other hand, corticospinal tracts arising from the cerebral cortex to go to the spinal cord pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Even though they pass through the posterior limb, we can see that they take the anterior aspects of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So that is the region occupied by the pyramidal system when it's passing through the internal capsule. The other regions of the internal capsule are occupied by other fibers. We are not talking about them today and in this particular lecture, and so we don't have to mention their locations. So you remember that the pyramidal tracts have just gone through the internal capsule within the cerebrum so that now they reach the brainstem. So let's talk about the course of pyramidal pathways within the brainstem. And these two images will help us a lot to conceptualize this. So from the cerebral cortex here, the fibers went through the coronal radiator, then passed through internal capsule to reach the brainstem. You see this region here is actually midbrain. This is pons, and that's medulla oblongata. So after internal capsule, they are basically on the brainstem. Now, the tract that we call corticospinal will pass through the whole of the brainstem to go to the spinal cord. However, the corticonuclear, because they terminate in the brainstem, will terminate at various levels of the brainstem, depending on the motor nucleus of cranial nerve being targeted. So some of the corticonuclear tract will terminate at the level of the midbrain. Some of them will terminate at the level of pons, and yet some of them will still terminate at the level of the medulla oblongata. But the corticospinal tracts will traverse the brainstem to reach the spinal cord. So when the pyramidal pathway is traversing the midbrain, which part of the midbrain do they cross? Or which part of the midbrain do they pass? If you know the structure of the midbrain, then you'll remember that it looks like a boxer short. This is the midbrain. In cross-section, the midbrain has what we call the crus cerebri, that one and that one. Posterior dorsomedial to the crus cerebri as the substantia nigra, and dorsomedial to that one is basically what we call the tegmentum that contains the red nucleus. We're focusing on the crus cerebri. The pyramidal tracts occupy the middle two-thirds of the crus cerebri. This image could be a better one in illustrating the anatomy of the midbrain with localization of the pyramidal pathway. So look at it. If this is the crus cerebri, we are saying that the middle two-thirds is the one occupied by the pyramidal pathways. That means that we remain with 1/6 laterally and 1/6 medially. Those 1/6 laterally and 1/6 medially are occupied by fibers which are not pyramidal, but they're also not extrapyramidal. Those are fibers that are coming from the cerebral cortex to land to pontine nuclei. So you call them corticopontine fibers. Depending on which cerebral cortex or lobe they arise from, we can give them other names. For example, you can have frontopontine, temporopontine, palatopontine, and occipitopontine. The frontopontine fibers are the ones that occupy the medial 1/6 of the crus cerebri. And the other pontine, corticopontine, occupy the lateral 1/6 of the crus cerebri. Then the middle 2/3 of the crus cerebri is occupied by the pyramidal system. Now, generally, we've already mentioned that pyramidal is corticospinal and corticonuclear. But generally speaking, again, the corticonuclear fibers will occupy the medial zones of that middle 2/3. So the corticonuclear occupy around that region, and then corticospinal occupy the other regions. Remember that at the level of midbrain, there are some two cranial nerves that arise here, and they have motor functions. The third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve, and the fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlear nerve. So because these nerves arise from here, their motor nuclei are located within the midbrain, we will have corticonuclear projection. We'll have some corticonuclear fibers terminating at the level of midbrain. They'll target the motor nucleus of oculomotor and the trochlear nucleus. The rest proceed. So after leaving midbrain, the fibers go to pons. What happens to the pyramidal tracts when they reach pons? Within pons, we have two zones, the basal pons and the pontine tegmental. The basal pons is the ventral aspect of pons. These fibers scatter within the basal pons in this manner. So the whole of that is pons, cross-section. This is pontine tegmentum, and this is basal pons. These fibers occupy the basal pons, but they are scattered within the basal pons. The scattering is because of some other fibers that arise from pontine nuclei to go to cerebellum, so we call them pontocerebellar fibers. So as they cross, decussate and cross, they'll tend to disperse the corticonuclear and corticospinal fibers, which are running longitudinally, vertically from up down through pons. And so the pyramidal tracts tend to be dispersed within pons, but they occupy the basal pons. Again, within pons, we have some motor nuclei of cranial nerves, and in particular, the motor nucleus of trigeminal, the motor nucleus of abducens, and the motor nucleus of facial nerve. And so for that reason, we'll have corticonuclear projection that will terminate into those motor nuclei. The rest proceeds to the medulla oblongata. So the fibers that proceed to the medulla oblongata converge on the ventral aspect of the medulla oblongata. The fibers that converge on the ventral aspect of the medulla oblongata form some longitudinal bundles in front of the medulla oblongata, which we call the medullary pyramids. So this is the pyramid, that's another pyramid. So these medullary pyramids are largely formed by the corticospinal fibers arising from the cerebral cortex, traversing the medulla to go down to the spinal cord. They're the ones that largely form this column. And I'm saying that because remember that now the corticonuclear, some of them have already terminated at the level of the midbrain. Some of them have terminated at the level of pons, and the last group of them will be terminating at the level of the medulla oblongata. So what remains to go down beyond that is largely the corticospinal tract. All in all, there's some cranial nerve motor nuclei that will still receive corticonuclear projection at the level of the medulla oblongata. And those are the ones which basically target what we call nucleus ambiguous. And we have the motor nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. Now, nucleus ambiguous is the nucleus that gives you efferent fibers that join glossopharyngeal, number 9, vagus, number 10, and accessory, cranial accessory, number 11. It's called ambiguous because it gives rise to those three motor fibers that join those three neurons or those three cranial nerves. Okay. This image shows you that story summarized. So corticospinal and corticonuclear arise from the cerebral cortex, pass through coronal artery, then enter through the internal capsule. Corticonuclear occupying the genu of the internal capsule, while the others occupying the posterior limb of the internal capsule. After that, they enter midbrain, and in the midbrain, they occupy the middle 2/3 of the crus cerebri of midbrain, during which some fibers terminate in the nucleus of oculomotor and nucleus of trochlea. The corticonuclear are the ones that do that. The rest proceed to pons, and in pons, they become scattered in the basal pons, during which some corticonuclear fibers terminate in some cranial nerve motor nucleus. So in the midbrain, we had termination to oculomotor and trochlea. In the pons, we have termination to trigeminal motor nucleus, the abducens nucleus, and the facial motor nucleus. The rest proceed to the medulla oblongata, where they converge into the medullary pyramid. But again, at the medulla, we know that there are those that terminate the corticonuclear projection that go to the hypoglossal nucleus and also to nucleus ambiguous. Nucleus ambiguous gives you motor fibers that join glossopharyngeal, number 9, vagus, number 10, and cranial accessory, number 11. Now, that is the course within the medulla. After the medulla, the corticospinal tracts are now the ones we're talking about. The corticospinal tracts beyond here crossover, majority of fibers crossover. And that point of crossing is what we call the motor decussation. That point of motor decussation marks the junction between the spinal cord and the brainstem. Perhaps if I take you back to the previous image. So this is the pyramid, and you can see that sulcus is a bit deep there. Then it disappears here. The reason it's disappearing is because these fibers cross over and this one cross over. The point of decussation is this region, what we call the pyramidal decussation or motor decussation. So this is the junction between brainstem above and spinal cord below. This also shows you that the corticospinal, so these are the ones that are corticonuclear terminating in midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. But this is corticospinal decussating there. Now, at the corticospinal decussation, majority of the fibers are the ones that decussate. The fibers of corticospinal that decussate occupy the lateral aspect of the spinal cord white matter. They occupy the lateral funiculus or the lateral white column of the spinal cord. And so they constitute the lateral corticospinal tract. Remember, that's in the spinal cord. That's the majority of the fibers of corticospinal. They cross over, they decussate. Not all corticospinal fibers will, however, decussate. There's a small percentage that do not decassate, maybe about 10%, maybe about 15% that do not decassate. The ones that do not decassate descend ipsilaterally, but they don't occupy the lateral white column of the spinal cord. They occupy the anterior white column of the spinal cord. And so they constitute the anterior corticospinal tract. So when we reach the spinal cord, we have two corticospinal tracts. The large majority is the lateral corticospinal tract, but the minority of fibers form the anterior or the ventral corticospinal tract. Remember, the ventral corticospinal tract is not crossed, while the lateral corticospinal tract is decassated. Even though the ventral corticospinal tract is not crossed, we know that where the ventral corticospinal tract will terminate, they usually cross over before they actually terminate. So they eventually cross over, except they cross over at the level of their termination. The fibers which will terminate at the cervical segments of the spinal cord will decassate at the cervical segments before synapsing. The ones which will reach the lumbar segments of the spinal cord will decassate at the lumbar segments before the synapse. So eventually, whether lateral or anterior, the corticospinal pathway eventually all decassates. Something unique about the decassation of cranial nerves, some cranial nerves give you bilateral projection. The upper motor neurons of cranial nerves gives you bilateral projection in some of them. So for example, you may have upper motor neuron corticonuclear projection that goes ipsilaterally as well as contralaterally on a motor nucleus. For example, the facial nucleus may have bilateral projection on some regions, especially the upper zone of it. And it may have just contralateral projection on some regions like the lower part of it. Okay, so this shows you the corticospinal and corticonuclear pathways, the corticonuclear displaying what I've called bilateral projection, as you can see here. So this is coming from this side, but gives you projection to both right and left nuclei. So that's what I call bilateral projection that characterizes some cranial nerve motor nuclei. They receive bilateral projection from corticonuclear fibers. Then majority of corticospinal decassate to form the lateral corticospinal tract. Fewer corticospinal tract do not decassate, forming the ventral corticospinal tract. Remember, the ventral corticospinal tract occupied the anterior white column, while the lateral corticospinal tract occupied the contralateral white column of the spinal cord. So these images trace for you those pathways. We have already looked at them. So from the cortex, coronary artery, internal capsule, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, then decassation, lateral corticospinal and anterior corticospinal. This also shows you the same. Remember that if you think about the motor homunculus, the corticonuclear fibers will arise from the lateral aspects, almost near the lateral fissure. The fibers that constitute corticonuclear will arise from those zones because this is the head region motor homunculus, as you can see on this other side. So the corticonuclear will arise from here, while the corticospinal that goes to lower limb, for example, will specifically arise from the medial aspects of the precentral gyrus. The rest of the story we've already explained. Termination to midbrain, termination in the pons, termination in the medulla, for corticonuclear and termination in the spinal cord for corticospinal pathways. So within the spinal cord, remember that this is the cross-section of the spinal cord. So this is the posterior white column, or rather is known as dorsal column of the spinal cord. This is the lateral white column, and this is the anterior white column of the spinal cord. This drawing shows you the localization of the lateral corticospinal tract and the localization of the anterior corticospinal tract. So the anterior corticospinal tract is the one labeled 1B, occupying the anterior white column of the spinal cord. The lateral corticospinal tract is this large red zone. Important to note is how the fibers also arrange within the lateral, within this tract, so that the cervical fibers are the ones which are more medial, while the sacral fibers are more lateral. So you'll have the cervical fibers more medial, followed by the ones which terminate in the thoracic segment of the spinal cord, followed by those that will terminate in the lumbar segments of the cord, and finally the ones that will terminate in the sacral segments of the cord are the most lateral. That's the organization of the fibers that constitute corticospinal tract while they're in the spinal cord. They are well arranged. This also shows you that. So maybe the main message to remember is that the fibers that terminate in the upper zones of the spinal cord are most medial near the gray matter, which is the point of termination. And the fibers which terminate much lower are most lateral, away from the point of termination. Remember, the gray matter here is the point of termination. So it makes sense for the fibers which terminate in the upper cord segments to be near this region, and the ones away to be that. Okay, so that is the pyramidal system. Remember, it's part of the upper motor neuron system. Let's compare that with what we're calling the extrapyramidal motor pathways. The extrapyramidal motor pathway constitutes upper motor neurons that arise from various nuclei in the brainstem. So they don't arise from the cerebral cortex, but they arise from various nuclei in the brainstem mainly. The nuclei in the brainstem that give you the extrapyramidal system are interconnected with other nuclei. For example, they have connection, the basal ganglia. They have connections with the cerebellum, to be in particular. You may also include the vestibular nuclei and reticular nuclei. So they have connections with those ones. So there are a lot of interconnection. The upper motor neuron that constitutes extrapyramidal system provide indirect control to muscles which are innervated by spinal nerves. The muscles that are innervated by spinal nerves are controlled by the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. And so the extrapyramidal system provide indirect control to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. Remember, these anterior horn cells of the spinal cord are the ones that innervate skeletal musculature. There are several pathways that constitute the extrapyramidal motor system, and I want to go through some of these. But before that, look at that image and see the extensive interconnection of the origin of the extrapyramidal system with other regions of the central nervous system. In terms of their location, they occupy different regions. So remember, the red ones represent descending tracts and the blue represent ascending tracts. In this, we already talked about lateral corticospinal, which is an example of pyramidal tract. And we talked about the ventral corticospinal, which is also an example of a pyramidal tract. Anything else other than those two are actually extrapyramidal. So you can see tectospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, rubrospinal. Let's talk about them. We begin with the rubrospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract arises from the red nucleus of the midbrain. So red nucleus is a motor nucleus within the tegmentum of midbrain. This is the cross-section of midbrain, so this is the red nucleus. Antero, or rather ventrolateral to that is the substantia nigra of midbrain, and ventrolateral that is the crus cerebri, which is occupied by the pyramidal tracts. So when you look at the midbrain, those red nucleus are usually on the upper parts of midbrain, as opposed to the lower parts of midbrain. But that's what forms the origin of the rubrospinal tract. As we'd already mentioned, these tracts have their control, the nuclei are controlled by other regions. So the red nucleus will be controlled by cerebellum, it's controlled by the basal ganglia and the like. The fibers that constitute the rubrospinal tract usually decussate, as you can see in this one, and descend on the contralateral aspect of the brainstem and spinal cord. They therefore occupy the lateral white matter of the spinal cord. When they get there, they occupy the lateral white column of the spinal cord together with the lateral corticospinal tract. The functions of rubrospinal tract, not very well defined in man. We note that they likely project to the upper spinal cord in humans. However, in other animals, they're actually extensive. They reach even the lumbar and sacral levels of the spinal cord. But in humans, evidence showed that they only reach the level of the cervical cord, and especially the upper cervical cord. So we don't quite know the function, but we've noted that lesions of the rubrospinal tract is actually similar to lesions of the corticospinal tract in terms of clinical presentation. Okay, the next one is the tectospinal tract. Tectospinal tract arises from the tectum of midbrain, and that's why it's called tectospinal. The tectum of midbrain is the dorsal aspect of midbrain that has some swellings. Those swellings are called the colliculi. We have 4 swellings. The upper 2 pairs, or rather the upper pair of swellings, is called the superior colliculus, and the lower pair is called the inferior colliculus. Tectospinal tract arises from the upper pair of swellings, which we call the superior colliculus. The tectospinal tract usually decussate and descend contralaterally as well, as you can see in that image. After the decussation, they'll descend to the spinal cord and occupy the ventral white matter of the spinal cord. So they occupy the ventral funiculus of the spinal cord. This tectospinal tract is being shown in this particular image as well. So you can see from the superior colliculus, they cross over, they descend and occupy the ventral white matter of the spinal cord there. Usually, tectospinal tract project again only to the cervical cord, and especially the upper cervical segments. Their main aim is to facilitate visual reflexes, enhancing rapid neck movements in response to light signals. So if you see bright light from one direction, you want to see where it's coming from, you immediately turn your neck to other direction. That's a visual reflex. Don't confuse visual reflexes with the pupillary light reflexes, which is about constriction of the pupil when you shine light to the eyes. This is when you're talking about you looking towards the direction of source of light, and especially some abrupt lights when you see it from one side. So you turn your neck towards the direction of the light. That's a visual reflex mediated by tectospinal tracts. We also have what we call the vestibulospinal tracts. There are two tracts that constitute the vestibulospinal tracts, the lateral and the medial vestibulospinal tracts. They arise from the vestibular nuclear complex. Vestibular nuclear complex is located at the level of the pons and the medulla. We can call that pontomedullary junction, so around that region. Usually, there's a lateral vestibulospinal tract that will be an ipsilateral pathway, so the blue. And there is, or rather, this lateral vestibulospinal tract, which is ipsilateral, so arising from this vestibular nuclei and descending on the same side, tend to excite extensor muscles of both the axial musculature and the limb musculature. The axial musculature referred to the muscles of the body axis, the muscle of the trunk. So the truncal muscles as well as the limb musculature are excited. And remember the extensor, so it target the extensor muscles and stimulate them. That's a bit different from the medial vestibulospinal tract, which is a bilateral tract, to mean that there are fibers which have crossed and there are fibers which have not crossed. So you have uncrossed and crossed fibers. Similar to the vestibular nuclei of this side, it will also give you bilateral projection. So therefore, the medial vestibulospinal tract is a mixed tract with both crossed and uncrossed fibers. Its main function is to inhibit the axial musculature. So it inhibits the muscles of the trunk. Remember, the lateral one will excite, this one inhibit. Okay, so that still shows you the vestibulospinal pathway, the medial one, which is a bilateral projection, and a lateral one, which is unilateral or ipsilateral. The other tract is what we call reticulospinal tract. The reticulospinal tracts arise from the brainstem reticular formation. Again, there are two, lateral and medial reticulospinal tract. This image shows you the reticular formation. Reticular formation, the brainstem, is a very diffuse system made up of reticular nuclei and reticular fibers. The reticular fibers tend to be interneurons within the brainstem. Reticular nuclei are aggregations of cell bodies scattered all over brainstem, which forms almost the core of the brainstem. So now, the reticulospinal tracts arise from this reticular nuclei and descend down to the spinal cord, hence the name. This image shows you still the reticulospinal pathways, the ones illustrated in red. So that those which arise from pons, and those which arise from the medulla oblongata as they go towards the spinal cord. As you can see, the ones which arise from the pons will tend to occupy the medial region, and so they're the ones which largely constitute the medial reticulospinal tract. And the ones which arise from the medulla oblongata will tend to occupy the lateral part, and therefore they're the ones that largely constitute the lateral reticulospinal tract. They tend to, however, show bilateral projection and a lot of collateral projections. So it means that there's a lot of mixing or synapsing of the fibers with a lot of collateral nerve fibers arising. The medial reticulospinal tract control the head, neck, trunk, and limb muscles to maintain posture. So this is the one largely from pons. The lateral reticulospinal tract is largely concerned with the efferent modulation of pain. So this is largely regulation of pain perception. You realize sometimes when you have a prick on the skin, you may feel pain, but that pain disappears, wins over some time. Partly because of what we call efferent modulation. The reticulospinal tract tend to inhibit the neurons that bring pain at the entry in the spinal cord, what we call the gate theory of pain modulation. So there is inhibition from the lateral reticulospinal to the pain fibers that enter so that they modulate so that you don't feel that pain constantly. That is reticulospinal tracts. And those are the major extrapyramidal tracts I want to talk about. But there are two others that I'll mention because of this lecture so that we have completion. This is what we call the solitary-spinal tract. The solitary-spinal tract is a small group of mostly cross fibers that arise from the nucleus solitarius of the medulla oblongata. So there is the solitary nucleus located within the medulla oblongata. This is the nucleus related to what we call the solitary tract. The solitary tract mainly control visceral afferents. So the nerve fibers that arise from the solitary nucleus are known to regulate respiration. Because they regulate respiration, the axons from these neurons will terminate onto the nerves that target the muscles of respiration. One of those nerves, the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve arises from segments C3, C4, C5 of the spinal cord. The anterior horn cells that constitute the phrenic nerve, that group is sometimes called the phrenic nucleus. And so those axons will terminate in the phrenic motor nucleus within the cervical cord segments 3, 4, 5 of the spinal cord. This is towards innervation of the thoracic diaphragm that is important for breathing. But we also have intercostal muscles which are innervated by intercostal nerves that arise from the thoracic segment of the cord. So some fibers from the solitary nucleus will terminate into the anterior horn cells that give rise to intercostal nerves that supply intercostal muscles. So that is solitary-spinal tract, important for respiration specifically. Then we have what we call the hypothalamus-spinal tract, a unique one for that matter, because this is not actually arising from the brainstem, but from the hypothalamus. These fibers arise from the hypothalamus, but descend ipsilaterally. They terminate at the spinal cord, they terminate on the lateral horn of the spinal cord gray matter. Remember, the lateral horn of the spinal cord gray matter is responsible for giving rise to preganglionic autonomic fibers. Anterior horn is the one which has somatic motor function. And so those tracts we've been mentioning, rubrospinal, reticulospinal, and the like, actually terminate in those anterior horn. However, The hypothalamus-spinal tract terminates in the lateral horn, the one responsible for giving rise to preganglionic autonomic neurons. So this is important in controlling sympathetic and parasympathetic functions. There are some segments which will not receive this termination because they don't give rise to preganglionic autonomic neurons. Remember, sympathetic arise from segment T1 to L2 or L3 there of the spinal cord. Parasympathetic arise from segments S2, S3, and S4 of the spinal cord. Well, parasympathetic also arises from some cranial nerves, but that's not spinal cord. Great, so those are the extrapyramidal tracts, and I've just placed this here so that you have a glimpse again of where these various descending tracts are located. We can use the one to the right to just try to trace the location. The lateral white column has the lateral corticospinal as well as the rubrospinal tract you can see there. You can also see the location of the reticulospinal tract there. 2C is the vestibulospinal tract you can see there. Now 2D, called olivospinal tract, is actually in debate. We don't think that there's actually a tract called the olivospinal tract, although it is in historical books. We think that olivospinal tract should actually be an ascending tract, is a spinal olivary tract, although it was thought that there's some fibers come from olivary nucleus to spinal cord. So there is contention about its existence, and that's why I've not talked about it in this particular lecture. Now let's do the last part of this lecture, talking about the lower motor neuron and its associated disorders. Whether we've talked about pyramidal or extrapyramidal, they all terminate at the lower motor neuron. Lower motor neurons are cholinergic neurons, which means that they release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. This is a bit different from the upper motor neurons, which tend to be glutaminergic, releasing glutamate as a neurotransmitter. Now, the lower motor neurons arise from either the brainstem, if they are cranial nerves, or arise from the spinal cord, if they're spinal nerves, and they terminate in skeletal muscles. The synapse between skeletal muscles and motor neurons is what we call the motor end plate or the neuromuscular junction. So in this image, we can see lower motor neuron arising from the brainstem to muscles. And here we can see lower motor neurons arising from the spinal cord to muscles. They have already been influenced by the upper motor neurons. So in this case, corticonuclear, and in this other case, corticospinal. We term lower motor neuron the final common pathway because whether a signal came through pyramidal or extrapyramidal, they will all have their effects through the lower motor neuron. Whether pyramidal or extrapyramidal system, their motor effects are mediated via the lower motor neuron. So the lower motor neuron is the final common pathway. That means controlled by both pyramidal system, this one, and the extrapyramidal system, this one. The spinal lower motor neurons have their cell bodies located within the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So they constitute the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. This shows you the spinal cord cross-section with the dorsal horn, lateral horn, and ventral horn. So the ventral horn, this region, is the one that gives rise to the somatic motor neurons of the spinal cord. This shows you that anatomy. So they come from the ventral horn of the spinal cord, occupy the ventral root of the spinal nerve to from the spinal nerve, they eventually terminate in skeletal muscles. That's different from the cranial ones. The cranial ones will arise from the cranial nerve motor nuclei. And that applies to those nerves we talked about, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, especially the mandibular division of trigeminal, the abducens, the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and cranial accessory arise from nucleus ambiguous, remember, so this one nucleus giving rise to those three, and then you have the nucleus of hypoglossal. Mentioned to you that these ones, their nucleus is located within the midbrain. Then these three, the nucleus located within pons, and then nucleus ambiguous and the motor nucleus of hypoglossal are located within the medulla oblongata. This image, we've now overseen it, but it displays what we talked about, how the corticonuclear fibers terminate in those nuclei that we talked about. Let's finish our story by talking about lesions that involve the lower motor neuron, but I'll also use this opportunity therefore to compare the lesions that involve the upper motor neuron. Because we're talking about lower motor neuron, let's begin with their lesions. So lower motor neuron lesions are lesions that affect the nerve fibers that travel either from the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord or from the cranial nerve motor nuclei. So the lesions that affect that part is what will be called the lower motor neuron. So this may involve either the nucleus itself within the brainstem or the nucleus within the anterior horn, or it may involve the peripheral nerve itself, or it may involve the junction, the neuromuscular junction. Clinical presentations of lower motor neuron lesions will include things like muscle atrophy. The muscle usually atrophies, almost beginning immediately. There'll be flaccid paralysis, so the muscle is paralyzed and it's so weak, it's floppy. It is manifested fasciculations, which are twitchings, especially we feel this in the tongue. This hypotonia, low muscle tone, decreased reflexes, and negative Babinski sign. Now, a positive Babinski sign is a reflex where if you touch the plantar aspect of the foot, the normal reflex that you will flex your toes and withdraw your foot. But Babinski reflex is a reflex where you actually extend your big toe, so the big toe goes up and the other toes flare out. So that's what we call positive Babinski, and positive Babinski sign is seen in upper motor neuron lesions. So when we do the Babinski test, we want to see whether the sign is present or not present. If present, which means the patient extends their toes and flares the other four, extends the big toe and flares the other four, it means that that's an upper motor neuron lesion. If that is not there, then we say that's a negative Babinski sign, which we see in lower motor neuron lesions. Examples of disease that can give you lower motor neuron lesion include polio. Generally, polio affects the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord, giving you paralysis. Bell's palsy, and that's why polio is also associated with atrophy. Bell's palsy is a disease that affects the facial nerve as it passes through the ear. And so usually when it's passing through the ear, especially the temporal bone, it may get some inflammation, usually caused by viral infection. So that's still a lower motor neuron lesion. Spinal muscular atrophy is a congenital disorder that affects the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord congenitally, associated with degeneration of this neuron. So that's lower motor neuron lesions. Let's compare that with upper motor neuron lesions. So upper motor neuron lesions are lesions that affect the neural pathway that is above the anterior horn cell of the spinal cord for the corticospinal, or above the motor nuclei of cranial nerves for the corticonuclear pathway. So basically, the neurons that affect the pathway before the pathway synapses with the lower motor neuron. So that means that involves the descending tract or where they come from. Clinical presentation of upper motor neuron lesions will include hyperreflexia, which is exaggerated reflexes, spasticity, which is also some excessive contractions or rigidity that muscles have, and positive Babinski sign, which I've already explained. Causes of upper motor neuron lesions include things like stroke, also known as cerebrovascular accidents, trauma either to the brain or spinal cord, and multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease that causes demyelination of CNS neurons. So due to this demyelination of CNS neurons, it may affect the descending tracts, and so giving you upper motor neuron lesions. All right, so this image shows you the green represents the upper motor neuron, and this other color represents the lower motor neuron. Remember that this is from the brainstem, so it represents a cranial nerve, and this from the spinal cord represents the spinal nerve. Great, so that is it for this lecture on the descending pathways. I hope you now have some understanding about descending tracts, and thank you very much. We'll stop there.